Morning, good afternoon, of course, good evening, depending on where you're located. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Troy Hubbard. I'll be your moderator for today's session. A few quick notes before we begin. First off, I'd like to direct your attention to the two chats below. There are two chats there that are available. One for general communications as you are interacting with each other. Please feel free to do so. And as well, a Q&A chat. If you have any questions for our presenter during the presentation, please feel free to drop them into the Q&A chat, and our presenter and their team will do their best to address those questions. I'll also note that during this presentation, we are going to be showing a few videos. Because these videos are streaming, you may notice a little bit of a lag in the video, and I just wanted to give you an awareness that that will be coming up. I'll also note that this session will be recorded for later playback. I thank you all for joining us today. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Lee for the opening comments. Lee, please go ahead.
Thanks, Troy. And yes, welcome everybody. And thanks for attending today's webcast, BES12.2, What's New for Enterprise Developers. My name is Lee Van Krumvoort, and I'm part of the developer programs and outreach team here at BlackBerry. And Ed Bourne, our Senior Enterprise Solutions Manager, will be presenting today. And as Troy said, we have the chat window there, so please put in your questions and get involved in the discussion for that. And we've got our team members standing by to help answer all those questions. And after the presentation, watch for the last slide, which will have some great links to some of the resources that Ed has supplied. So with that, I'll hand things off to Ed.
Thank you, Lee. So today's presentation, I'm going to be covering over a number of different features that are new with BES12.2 for developers. And I noticed in the comments made before the presentation, a number of people were concerned that I wasn't going to talk about anything on BlackBerry 10. That is a key item of what's new. In particular, I'm going to be showing off what you can do with BlackBerry 10 with certificates and single sign-on a little bit later with a demo. First things first. This is a bit of a boilerplate slide that I'm sure everybody's seen at some point or another. But I think it's worth reviewing because there's a number of key changes to BES12.2 that I think that tie back into this particular kind of a slide. So on the right-hand side, we've got our traditional mix of devices. Once upon a time it was just BlackBerry, but of course now we support many different platforms, iOS, Android, and Windows Phone devices. Over on the left-hand side, we have our BES12. We have third-party applications, web servers, and so on and so on. One of the key differences that I'm going to be highlighting a little bit later that is changed in 12.2 is how that BES12 on the left-hand side communicates with those devices on the right-hand side. The data channel is still works in the same manner that you see on the picture, going through the firewall, through BlackBerry infrastructure, through your Wi-Fi or your carrier. But we've got an interesting update. So let me move ahead. What's new? So I'm going to highlight these 5 areas. There's a lot of other bug fixes and other minor changes that happen inside of BES12, but I'm not here to describe BES12 for BES administrators. I'm here to describe it for BES developers. So what's new that a BES developer or an enterprise developer would be interested in? First off, we now support Android for Work, starting with Lollipop, which is Android 5.1. We also support Samsung KNOX. Now, in some earlier versions of this presentation, in particular at launch, we highlighted the fact that at launch we supported KNOX devices starting with version 2.4. That actually had nothing to do with the BES12 launch. It had to do with the client that you install on an Android device to pair your device to the BES. That has been updated since then, so if those of you with sharp eyes, we now support KNOX 2.3 and above. We also now support Apple Device Enrolment Program. That's part of Apple's method for activating devices in an enterprise, along with support for VPP, which I'll cover a bit later as well. We also now have something called BlackBerry Secure Connect Plus. what is BlackBerry Secure Connect Plus? It's probably the biggest single change to come with BES12. For longtime BlackBerry fans, we've supported the communication between the BES and the device with something called MDSCS, or Mobile Data Service Connection Service. That has now been updated as of 12.2 with BlackBerry Secure Connect Plus. I'll get into some more details on what exactly that change means, but the single biggest change it means is it now supports not only TCP/IP, which we traditionally always supported, but we now support the UDP protocol. And lastly, and the part I've chosen on this presentation to focus on for my demo, we now support client and SCEP certificates. Specifically, we now support them for Android. So I've got a very extensive demo showing how you can use that certificate support along with Android and iOS and BlackBerry 10 to do a single sign-on. So look forward to that at the end of this presentation. Android for Work. So what's new with Android for Work? Well, Android for Work, if you're not familiar with it, is an update that Google added to the Android operating system. I think they started it back in the 4.4 days in KitKat. It didn't get a lot of traction. It had a lot of issues about how you would configure it and set it up. But starting with 5.0 and starting with us with 5.1, the support is actually embedded now into all Android phones using that OS release, and it makes for configuration relatively trivial. You don't need to do a lot of wrapping. You don't need to do anything special to make the application work. It simply pairs very simply with a BES12 environment. Android for Work, if you're not familiar with it, is not the traditional BlackBerry 10 way of thinking about a personal space and a workspace. Things are a little more blended. You have applications that are identified with a suitcase symbol that refers to the fact that they're in the protected space on that phone. And then you have applications that you would normally use, your personal applications. They're all blended into the same screen. I keep everything sort of separate on one screen for myself and on another screen for my personal stuff. But in practice, what it means is that the workspace, the work profile, is completely managed by your BES12 server. If, like with BlackBerry 10, if your device gets lost or you need to reinitialize it and so on, the BES administrator can send a kill packet and wipe out that space. Applications that are stored within that space are secure. The passwords are secure. Data you store in that space are secure, and so on and so on. Android for Work. Some interesting little details about what makes Android for Work interesting. If you've used our existing Android solution, Android Secure Workspace, that product requires you to wrap applications in order to deploy them inside the Secure Workspace. With Android for Work, since it's built into the operating system, no app wrapping is required. In fact, it will let you deploy apps right from Google Play inside the workspace. One interesting tidbit for me when I first set up an Android for Work device as a developer was that the entire device had to be encrypted. Not a bad idea to do anyways, but it does mean that if you've got a device with a lot of space, it can take quite a while for that entire thing to get encrypted. It's not just simply creating a workspace and encrypting that little tiny new workspace of yours. It's encrypting all 16 gigs or 32 gigs or whatever size of memory you have built into your phone. So that can take quite a while. But other than that, it seems to work pretty nicely, and the fact that everything's embedded right in the operating system is very good. Samsung KNOX. If you're going to pick an Android favorite for me, this is my favorite at the moment, perhaps because it looks so much like what I'm used to with BlackBerry 10. They do follow a traditional model of an enterprise space and a personal space. I've showed that on the screen here with two separate pictures. So in particular, you've got a little button typically, or there's a swipe gesture you can use to go from the enterprise to the personal space. Only the enterprise space is encrypted, so when you're setting up a KNOX device, unlike Android for Work, it can happen much quicker because it's not encrypting the entire phone. Like Android for Work and like BlackBerry 10, anything that's stored inside the enterprise space is managed and controlled from the BES10 server. What's a little bit different perhaps from Android for Work is that they've got this idea of having multiple layers of encryption before you get up to the space where the enterprise space is. It seems rather reminiscent to my ears of what we've always done traditionally with BlackBerry 10, where since we're the manufacturer of the phone, we can make sure that when the phone turns on and that the first bootloader opens, as you go up the food chain till you get to eventually to the BlackBerry 10 operating system, it ensures that your phone is not jailbroken by making sure that the previous sort of boot sequence is done securely. Samsung KNOX seems to be following that kind of a model. At any rate, you can read up on Samsung KNOX details later. Like Android for Work, you have some very similar abilities. No app wrapping is required. Since the operating system changes required to make the workspace occur are built into the phones themselves, you don't have to wrap applications like we do for Android Secure Workspace. The workspace is encrypted, as I mentioned. The BES admin can assign apps from Google Play or enterprise apps to the KNOX workspace, but you cannot sideload into the KNOX workspace right now. That was kind of irritating for me when I first noticed it, simply because when I'm building an application and I'm deploying it and I want to see what it looks like inside the workspace, I'm just so used to my BlackBerry 10 experience where I can sideload it and I don't really notice the difference. But on KNOX, you have to load the application onto the server, very similar to what we do with Android for Secure Workspace, and then from there it can get deployed into your workspace. Bit of a little pain, but you can deal with it. Support for SCEP and certificates, both for Android, Samsung KNOX, and for Android, and Android for Secure Workspace in general. I mentioned it here on this slide. I think I mentioned it earlier as well, but I didn't highlight it. There is no SCEP client. If you're not sure what SCEP is, it's basically a mechanism for distributing certificates securely, well, almost securely, from your backend certificate server up to your individual devices. So in this particular case, the BES itself acts as the proxy. It will connect itself to whatever you're using for your certificates generation, and it will pass those certificates up through to the SCEP client. SCEP clients are built into BlackBerry 10. They always have been, and they're also built into iOS, but they've never been built into Android. So what we've done to resolve this issue for KNOX, Android for Work, and for Secure Workspace version of Android is we built in a SCEP client into our BES12 client that you would install in order to make those applications set up the workspace or the work perimeter. One interesting little feature on the Samsung KNOX device that you don't see very often is it does have an app lock mode. So if you're a developer building an application for Android and that application is going to take over the device, for example, maybe you're using the device only to, I don't know, remotely control your TV or you're using it as a trucking agent and you're using it to just manage inventory and you're not supposed to be checking email or playing video games or whatever, you can actually lock the device to run only one application. And you can manage that from the BES. For iOS, the only big update for iOS with 12.2 was the support for Apple's Device Enrolment Program. So now using the BES12 console, you can now enroll devices, Apple devices, onto the BES in a much simpler way. They've also got a volume purchase program, which if you haven't seen before, is actually kind of unique to Apple. It's actually a pretty clever idea. I'd like to see it elsewhere. Basically, the idea is if you buy an application from Apple's store, and you say, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, I think all my employees should have a copy of this application. The only way you could do it traditionally with a storefront for a device where each person is responsible for their own ID was you would purchase it and then perhaps expense it back to your company. Kind of a ridiculous proposition in my mind for a 99-cent app or even for a $10 app. With Apple's volume purchase program, what they let you do is buy applications in bulk. Like you can buy 20 licenses to an application. You can store that data on your BES, and as each user downloads that application, instead of it being charged to their personal account on iTunes, it gets deducted from the application license pool that's on the BES itself. of course, until you run out, and then you have to buy some more. Clever idea. Don't often say that about Apple. BlackBerry Secure Connect Plus. This is probably the biggest technical change in 12.2, and I know for the work that I do with a lot of our partners, anybody that deals with anything that requires UDP. UDP is a sort of a competing protocol with TCP/IP with some key advantages. It's usually faster, but it's also a lossy protocol, meaning you can drop packets and you're supposed to be able to recover from that. Not an issue if you're trying to deal with something like voice communication, for example, or streaming media or streaming audio. People are willing to tolerate small glitches in their audio or their video where they wouldn't accept that glitch. For example, if you're transferring a document, you want the entire document to get there correctly. But for a real-time application with streaming audio or video, you can deal with the small glitches. UDP gives you that. Well, UDP was not supported up until this release of BlackBerry. So starting with this release, we now have an option of BlackBerry Secure Connect Plus. If you have a device that's actually connected to a BES, you can actually go and see this from inside your phone. Now, BlackBerry Secure Connect Plus was introduced specifically to support BlackBerry 10 and Android. So those technologies are now being supported using this. So if you're using Samsung KNOX or using Android for work, you're using BlackBerry Secure Connect Plus. If you're using BlackBerry 10, you can actually use the older protocol if you want, but it will default by design to using the new one with UDP support. I'm not a BES administrator, but if you want to dig into the details, you can go into the documentation and they can show you how you can play with those settings for the BlackBerry 10 devices. For Secure Workspace, in other words, the wrapping solution that we have inside of iOS and vanilla Android, that continues to use a hybrid, something called BlackBerry Connect Plus, which was developed from MDS-CS and is TCP/IP only. So no UDP support for iOS yet, and you can see that, of course, in the little icon on the right there, where I'm only showing a BlackBerry 10 device and a Android device. So UDP support with BlackBerry Secure Connect Plus. There are some posts on our dev blog where we've discussed this in more detail. There's, of course, a lot more information about this in the documentation. And you're welcome to ask questions about this on the secure chat. One of my colleagues, I'm sure, would love to answer if you've got any more questions about UDP support. And if you're one of my partners, I'm sure you've already asked these questions before. BES12, certificate support. One of the wonderful things about having a mobile device is being able to connect seamlessly back into your corporate environment. But traditionally, that's always meant, at least for me, logging in. If I'm going into a corporate website or I've got an application pulling down from a corporate site, invariably there's somebody who's built their own security model or they're tied it into their own personal Active Directory instance or whatever the heck it happens to be. And it always frustrates me when they can't just use a centralized, secure, single sign-on, or more importantly, zero sign-on, which is what I really want, method of connecting. So I don't have to click on anything. When I check my email on my BES10 device, I don't have to log in to check my email. When I click on email, it just comes up. When I click on my web browser and I go to a certain web page inside the company, if it asks me for my authentication, I always put my hands up going, why, oh why am I telling you who I am? My phone knows who I am. The BES knows who I am. My email knows how to get to me. Why do I have to identify myself to you, Mr. Browser? So I'm going to explain in a demo shortly about how to perform that with BES12. But here's one of the key features with BES12.2. We now support the SCEP client, as I mentioned earlier. In the BES12 client, that's the logo you would see if you were installing this from Google Play, on Android. So Android Secure Workspace, Android for Work, and KNOX all support the BES certificate SCEP model now through the BES12 client. And of course, iOS and BlackBerry 10 have been supporting this for a while. It's built into the operating system. What can you use with this wonderful new tool? You can distribute client certificates. We already do so right now for BES because in order for you to have that seamless email experience, you need an email certificate. You may have one there for Wi-Fi so that when your device connects to your corporate Wi-Fi, you don't have to constantly type in your credentials in order to connect. And for the purposes of my demo shortly, I'm going to show you how to do this with a certificate that identifies you as an individual for application, doing either single sign-on or actually the example I'm going to show you today is zero sign-on. So how's that for exciting? Now I've ripped through all these features pretty quickly here. Just going to check the chat here for a second before I move on. I'll come back to some of these questions shortly. I think I might answer a few of them in my presentation. BES12 client certificates. On the right-hand side, I'm showing a screenshot from an Android device. This is done specifically because, of course, there's no SCEP client on Android. So what we do is we actually host the certificates inside the application itself. Some of them are actually pushed onto the device as well, into the Android certificate store. So for example, on the right-hand side there, this is a sample from one of my colleagues who's actually on the chat here, EK. And you can see that there's a number of CA certificates. Some are used to identify your device or your BES12 client to the BES itself. Some are used for identifying you for email. And the AT&T Lab one that you see there in the bottom one, EDEK tests, are used to identify this device for application login. If you've got a BlackBerry 10 or an iOS device, since the SCEP client is already built in, the certificates are placed into their respective certificate stores silently right now. So if you were to go into your BlackBerry 10 device, you go into the settings, you go into security, and you go into certificates, you'll notice a number of certificates that are placed in there by the BES today. And if you're using a SCEP, you might even notice some that are put in there individually. On iOS, it's done through the configuration profile, but the SCEP client is done the same way. Okay, here's my little demo. So BES12 certificate demo. What am I trying to accomplish here? Well, what I'm trying to accomplish is how can I have a secure zero sign-on for my users with certificates? Okay, zero sign-on, not single sign-on, zero sign-on. And the difference I'm making here is once I've identified the certificate, I no longer ever want to have to type in my username or password or even select a certificate to connect back in and again. If I'm going to do this with a single sign-on, what that's referring to is I have to type in my username or credentials the first time and then I continue on doing so until I close the application or browser or my credentials change. But in this particular case, I'm doing it with a certificate and it's zero sign-on. It has some added benefits in that if my certificate changes, if the SCEP server, for example, updates my certificate because it's expired, that should be handled seamlessly. It'll go right into the certificate store. Now, of course, this is always going to work on BlackBerry 10. We make those devices. But how can I make this work if I have iOS or Android devices? And what benefit do I have from this ability of zero sign-on? How do I use this in an actual application? So I'm going to show you a very, very simple HTML5 application. It's kind of a crazy simple example with no redeeming UI qualities at all. But I'll leave it to my betters in the world of CSS and UI to make a fun, good-looking application. Oh, I've lost the presentation. Hi, Troy, if you're yeah. Yep, I'm actually not to the demo part quite yet. Thank you. Almost. I'll let you know. Okay, first things first. What is the recipe that I'm going to use to build this application demo? First thing first, you need a source of certificates. So you either need an NDES or you're going to have to use self-signed certificates. Now, this example I'm going to go through today would work with self-signed certificates. In fact, I've got a presentation that I put on the dev blog just for BlackBerry 10, I think a year and a half or so ago, where I use self-signed certificates to show how to do this exact same thing. But for the purposes of today, I didn't want to do that. I want to do this with NDES. I want an actual network store that's going to auto-generate certificates for me. And then using SCEP on my BES, I want to have those certificates show up seamlessly on my Android device, and my iOS device, and my BlackBerry 10 device. And some magical BES administrator, I'm going to give a shout out to a colleague of mine, Mike Fisher, who's forgotten more about BES than I'll ever know, who's actually helped me with all of this setup stuff. So I'm smart enough to be dangerous when it comes to administering and configuring a BES, but I'm not a BES administrator. I am a developer. So if you have any specific questions that get too detailed, I'll defer to I might defer to him at some point. Basically, I've got this magical box that will assign certificates through the BES to my phone. So what do I need to do as a developer? Well, in my particular case, I am a pretty smart guy when it comes to web development. So I'm going to configure a web server, and I'm going to set up a test page to use that certificate from the phone to identify myself to the web page and hopefully identify myself in such a way that I never have to log in again. So for the purposes of the example today, I'm actually using an IIS server, and I'm using a very simple ASPX file, a little 3-line Visual Basic application. I'll show you a little bit later. I've also configured the IIS server so that it will take the certificate that I'm passing it and map it to Active Directory credentials, so it knows who I am, not only because that's what I say I am in the certificate, but it knows who I am in terms of Active Directory if I want to use that inside that web application to do something AD-ish. Lastly, I want to do this on BES-activated devices. So, I'm a BlackBerry guy, so of course I'm going to make this work on BlackBerry 10, but I'm going to show you today how to make that also work with iOS and Android. Now, there's 5 choices here, of course. There's Android Secure Workspace, Android KNOX, and Android for Work. For the benefit of today, I'm just going to show you a brief clip of it running on Android for Work. One little note here. Because of the way that SCEP works and is set up with iOS and BlackBerry 10, in order to get the certificate that shows up on the phone to actually map to the domain where I want to log in, you also need to set up a single sign-on profile with iOS so that iOS and BB10 certificates are used correctly. So there's a little corollary there on my point number 2 about configuring your BES for SCEP. Yes, you can push the certificate up that identifies me, but the server needs to be told that if that certificate's coming back in, that it applies to a particular domain so that the single sign-on will actually work correctly. So what does that look like? Now, this is a terrible screenshot of 2 pages on the administration console. So if you can't read this because the screen is way too fuzzy, let me paint a picture with some words. The screen on the left and the screen on the right are both from the policies page on the BES12 server. So the one on the left is where you would configure a SCEP profile, and the one on the right is where you configure single sign-on. Again, I'm not a BES administrator. I'm smart enough to be dangerous, but hopefully, like myself, you've got some colleague who's a smart guy in the background who knows all about certificate setups and getting SCEP running and so on and so on. But if you don't, these are the places you want to point to or you want to educate yourself about. In the terms of the SCEP profile on the left-hand side, you can't quite see it at the bottom, but there's 3 buttons there where you not only identify where you're getting these certificates from, but you identify particular settings that you need to do for BlackBerry, for iOS, and for Android. And in the Android one, it's further broken out by Android for Work and KNOX and Secure Workspace. On the right-hand side, the single sign-on profile is just for BlackBerry and iOS. It's not needed for Android for Work or KNOX or Android Secure Workspace because they don't support SCEP in the first place. So the fact that the certificates are on there and Work is just because that's how we designed the BES12 client to do it for ourselves. On the right-hand side, that screen is there to take advantage of settings that are already there on iOS and BlackBerry 10 and to turn them on to allow single sign-on. So here's the entire presentation's credibility on a developer down to 3 lines of text. And I'm ashamed to say that I didn't even write that code. I just copied it from a website, and I'll make a reference to it at the end of the website, at the end of the presentation, if you want to go and read what this guy did. So all I'm doing here is I've got an ASPX file that I call the test.aspx, and that's literally the entire contents of that page, that application. It's basically barfing out to the screen all the request variables that are available. And on the right-hand side, if you squint real careful, inside the red box there, amongst all the variables that it exports out, it's showing you who the authorized user is, and you'll notice that right underneath that there's no authorized password. So my colleague EK, or Icho here on the user identification, is showing no password being typed in because we didn't use one. We made a connection, we passed a certificate in. This is going to an HTTPS page because it's secure, it's SSL, and I want to make single sign-on work, or zero sign-on I should say. And the result is that this page, you can go and grab those attributes using JavaScript, and you can see who the person is that logged in and a whole bunch of other stuff. Okay? For the demo today, I'm not going to do this live because I tried doing it with a camera before and it's just not worth the grief. So I made three separate recordings. In fact, EK did this for me using her own credentials. She's waving me off saying, don't take credit. I guess you deserve credit. You did it. We're doing it for a BlackBerry Classic running on 10.3.2. We're doing it from iPhone 4S running iOS 8.4. And we're doing it from a Nexus 7 tablet running Android 5.1, which is, of course, got Android for Work configured on it. Okay. Now I'm going to the demos, to the videos. Mr. Hubbard, pass me over. Thank you. And here is my videos. First video up, I'm going to show you BlackBerry 10. So if you go into settings and you go into security, oh, make that bigger. Yes, I'll make that bigger. There we go. You can go into that and you can identify your own certificate. So in this particular case, this certificate is coming up as EK. And you see the little suitcase on the side there. That symbol refers to the fact that this certificate is in the workspace. If I'm in the certificate, let me pause this. If you look underneath on the details of what the certificate is using or doing, let me go back a little bit here. Pause. I got back far enough. There we go. You'll notice at the very top there that this certificate can authenticate a client. Okay, so the NDES server, I don't know if you can read that, but trust me, that's what it says. The certificate can authenticate a client. The NDES server has assigned a certificate to EK. It's been distributed from the BES server through SCEP up to the BlackBerry 10 phone. It was deployed inside the certificate store in the workspace perimeter. And that certificate has the ability to identify her to the server or to an application. Okay, so I'm going to go back out of this now. What does that look like in terms of an actual running application? Let me start that again. This is too quick. So we're clicking on this web link to an internal IIS server. We're going in through the work browser. And boom, we have a web page. Now you can't read that because the font's too blurry, but that's the same page that we were looking at just a minute ago on the previous page. And it'll show that EK is logged in and there is no value to her password because she used a certificate. This is a truly zero sign-in solution. You'll notice that when we clicked on the link and the page opened, this is an HTTPS page, secure page. It didn't ask for my basic authentication. It didn't ask for my credentials. It didn't even ask for my certificate. The reason it didn't ask for my certificate, actually, because this was a clean running of the application, was because there was only one certificate. So it knew that this server was on the AT&T lab. It checked the certificate store, found a certificate for AT&T lab. There was only one of them. Tried it, let me in, zero sign-on. Okay. So let me close BlackBerry 10. What does this look like on iOS? Let's start off with this one. So this is our 4S phone, and if you go into settings again, you go into general, scroll, 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 go into profiles, scroll, scroll, scroll. You open up the profiles. I don't know if you can see it there, but it's pointing out there at the bottom that there's actually two certificates in this profile. So we'll keep pressing play. There's the two certificates. They look confusingly very similar. If you go into the details of them, though, one of them is for email and one of them is for this application. So EK just happens to know which one is which. And if you look at the very top here where it says SCEP ED EK test, for those of you with very sharp eyes, you might have noticed earlier when I was showing my screenshot of my SCEP profile, that was the name of the SCEP profile that I was using to push out certificates to individual users. So in my particular case, there was a certificate on my phone called Ed Bourne, and EK's there's one EK Chung. My colleague Mike Fisher had one called Mike Fisher, but we're all being pushed by that profile because we're all members of that profile with certificates from the main store. Okay. And there's a whole bunch of other stuff inside of that certificate. All very exciting if you like to read certificates. So, how do we use it? Here we go. So we're going to go into the browser, and we go to the browser, and we go to the web page, and boom, it requires a certificate. Okay. We continue. This is not zero sign-on yet. Boom, we have a choice. I'm just going to pause it for a second. There's a choice, of course, because there are two certificates assigned that are valid for this domain. Only one of them is valid for identifying EK as the application. She happened to know it was the bottom one, so she clicked on it. And we get into the application, and boom, there's that page that we saw earlier again. Oh, well, we zoom in this time. And, of course, you can see again that EK is the logged-in user. There is no password identified. It's done with that certificate. Now, in case anybody wants to bust me open for saying zero sign-on all the time on this presentation, the very first time you launch this application, the browser will ask you for which certificate you want to use. Once you've done it the initial time, it will no longer ask you to do that again and again and again. In the case of BlackBerry 10, we'd only installed one certificate. On the case of this installation here, EK's phone had two separate certificates, one for email, one for this zero sign-in application. Since the web page couldn't tell which one you wanted to use, she had to pick it. But if you went back into this page going forward, every single time until that certificate expires, she would get to this page directly. It would be zero sign-on. Okay. Android for Work, the big finale here. In this particular case, we're not going to show you where the certificate store is. I'd love to ask a question if anybody knows why, but I said it earlier in the presentation, of course. There is no certificate store for, there's no SCEP client on Android. So there's no point in me showing you those. If you remember earlier in the presentation, I showed a screenshot, I should say, where you could see all these certificates listed on an Android device. That, in fact, they were actually being listed inside the BES12 client application because that's where they're pushed. There is no SCEP client on Android. I would love to know the thinking of Google why they didn't put a SCEP client in there. But at any rate, they didn't. We did inside the BES12 client. Certificate gets stored there. The work browser can access those client certificates. And here we go. So we click on the web page. Press return. I don't know if anybody caught that, so I'm just going to press pause for a second. Go back a bit in the video here. We cheated a bit here. Oops, let me go back again. We cheated a bit. Oh, okay, trust me, in case you missed it. We used incognito mode on the Chrome browser here. Why did we do that? For the very reason why I was pointing out why you had to select a certificate on iOS. The first time you log into a web page, like this web page, it can't tell which certificate you're requesting to use. So in this particular case, we have to go and pick the one we want. For whatever reason, it's not identified as EK or Ed Bourne in this case. I actually have to pick the policy name, and underneath it you can see my name, CN Ed Bourne. So as we press the little button here, choose the certificate, and allow, it takes us into the page, and we're here. Why did I use incognito mode? You can see that little icon in the corner that tells you this is incognito mode in my browser. For the simplest of reason, as a developer, I didn't want to have to constantly wipe the cache on my browser just to test that the certificate stuff was working, because this is zero sign-in. Every time you connect, it will not ask you for that certificate. So I went in incognito mode. The cache is clear. Off I go, and I'm in. So if we can go back to the presentation, please. Mr. Troy, if I can go back to... Oh, there we go. I got to stop sharing. My bad. Okay, so let me wrap up here. So I've just done a demo showing how you can use SCEP to push certificates to all these different platforms. You can then use them inside of an HTML5 application to identify who you are seamlessly, zero sign-on. I showed a couple little tricks I like to use, like, for example, using incognito mode so I don't have to wipe the cache all the time to see things that are working. Where can you get more information about how to do all of this stuff? Well, if we go back to the main part of this presentation, which is what's new in BES12, I'd strongly suggest you go to the help.blackberry.com site and check out the BES12 documentation. Interestingly, in 12.2, the overview and what's new guide is actually a massive document. I can't remember how many pages it is, like 80 or 90 pages, with tons of graphics and lots of detail. I really recommend looking at that page. It goes into quite a bit of detail about what's new in 12.2. It goes into great detail on how to configure and set up the stuff for Android and so on. It goes into a lot of detail about what's new about all the UDP stuff and the P2E stuff, the BlackBerry Secure Connect Plus stuff, for those of you that are interested in doing UDP type communications. Since support for KNOX and Android for Work is such a big part of this release, I looked around for a bunch of documents explaining, like why is one better than the other than my little superficial overview on playing with the two. I found this comparison site at Samsung. It's actually pretty good. Of course, it's biased. Samsung wants to tell you why they're better than Android for Work, but it still does a pretty good job of listing a lot of the different bullets about why one is better than another. And of course, you can then compare that to your existing knowledge, I would hope, around Android with Secure Workspace. For the actual demo, again, I would suggest you either read up on NDES or self-signed certificates and SCEP, or more importantly, go back to the BES documentation and read up on how to manage that stuff. But in terms of how to set up an IIS server, this document here from Microsoft on IIS client certificate mapping was I found really, really helpful. And this page here on ASP, the net.net sample, I'll give a full shout out here to the guy on the internet who posted that blog post on the 3-line piece of code that I used. Really handy. And there's your demo in a nutshell. So I'm going to be sticking around for quite a bit of while here to answer any Q&A chat questions. I thank you very much for your time today, and I'll thank my colleague Mike Fisher, and in particular EK here who's on chat, and others who've been answering questions. So thank you for your time today, and that's what's new for enterprise developers.
That's great. Thanks a lot, Ed. Great presentation. Just want to remind everybody on the call that to watch for the BlackBerry Dev blog for the recording of this presentation. If you missed a few things, you can go back in and check out that resource, or share that resource, with somebody close in your group who would find that useful. As Ed mentioned, himself and the rest of the team are going to be in the chat to answer all your questions. Thank you very much to Mr. Ed Bourne for presenting today, and thank you, EK, for all the support on this presentation as well. As mentioned, watch for the webcast on the blog, and also watch for upcoming communications, including our enterprise newsletter. Thanks very much, and I'll hand it back over to Troy.
Thanks, Lee. Great job by everyone. At this time, I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in a future event.